but everybody else gets 5 minutes to present their research, what they're doing for Imana. And afterwards, we'll try and identify some topics of interest that we'll discuss afterwards. So if anyone can find, well, ideally, you guys will also have some questions and some themes maybe that we can discuss in detail. Yeah? So pay attention, and there'll be an exam afterwards. So let's move straight to business, I would say. So the first one on my list is Aurelie.
I work for the Natural Resources Institute, and 6 months ago we were awarded a Imana grant. Our project is called NutriPillows. The background of the project is on post-harvest losses. So according to the FAO, there are huge post-harvest losses in the value chain. So 1/3 of the food that is produced is actually lost between the harvest and the consumer. And this may have an implication on food security, especially in places where food is scarce, so in some developing countries. So the question is, how can we reduce those post-harvest losses? How can we mitigate those post-harvest losses? So the first thing we could do is try to understand those. And this, so try to estimate those post-harvest losses. And this is what the AFLIS project is doing currently in sub-Saharan Africa. So the AFLIS project, it stands for African Post-Harvest Loss Indicator System, and it's an online platform where people can access. Actually, it's an open access, and you have on this platform there are estimates for post-harvest losses. So for quantities of food that are lost for different crops. So this is something that is currently available. But we can go a step further to understand post-harvest losses in terms of food security. So this is what we are proposing to do with the NutriPillows. So it's to look at post-harvest losses from a nutritional perspective. So in this project, we are aiming to develop a methodology to estimate nutritional post-harvest losses from harvest to the market. And so the first thing we need to understand is what are nutritional post-harvest losses. There are 2 types of nutritional post-harvest losses. So on one hand, you've got the physical losses. So imagine that you are transporting maize and you are losing the maize. During the transport, you are losing maize. So all the physical loss is equivalent to a nutritional loss. So that means you're losing, for instance, 100 kilograms of maize. You are losing all the protein, all the nutrients that are in the maize. So this is one type. And then you've got the nutritional losses that are not directly associated with weight losses. So one example is the storage. So the storage of a dry product like orange fresh sweet potato, you store your product, so you're not losing something physically, but you're losing nutritionally. So you're losing vitamin A without necessarily losing weight. So we have to capture these 2 types of post-harvest nutritional losses. And that's what we are proposing to do with the NutriPillows. And how will we do that? We will use a combination of approaches with literature review, lab study, and field verification. So the aim is to develop a very robust methodology. And because it's a short project, we only have 2 years, we are focused on specific things. So we are focusing on 3 crops that are of importance in sub-Saharan Africa: root crops, cereals, and pulses. And then we are focusing on nutrients and micronutrients where there is the most deficiency So we have iron, vitamin A, and zinc. And at the end of the project, the aim will be to develop an open access tool so people can access estimate for nutritional post-harvest losses along the value chain and for those crops.
So the next speaker will be Amy Webb-Girard, who will talk about her research.
So good afternoon. My name is Amy Webb-Girard from the Emory Rollins School of Public Health, and I'm working on a project with the International Livestock Research Institute. And so our work is developing and validating a women's empowerment specific for livestock livelihoods and exploring pathways to impact for maternal and child nutrition. And this project has multiple components to it, taking place in 3 separate contexts: in northern Kenya, in Tanzania, and in Ethiopia, so specifically focusing in East Africa. The multiple components that we are working on to develop this index and validate it include extensive qualitative research in these different contexts, and I should point out that they also cover different value chains. So in Ethiopia, we're looking more at a poultry value chain, and in northern Kenya and Tanzania, we're looking at cattle value chains, cattle keeping value chains and dairy value chains. And so what we have done is in addition to the qualitative research that we are doing to explore specific domains of empowerment that may be important for maternal and child nutrition in the context of livestock heavy livelihoods, we're also exploring DHS data from those countries, and actually additionally in Rwanda and Uganda, so the 5-country East Africa region. And with that, we have developed an index of empowerment based on the data that are available in DHS using an exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis approach that allows us to use a data-driven and theoretically informed approach to develop an index. And within that index, we were looking specifically at Kabir's framework for empowerment. So looking at assets, looking at decision-making, and looking at attitudes as they lead to achievements in maternal and child nutrition. And the analysis of the DHS data, we examined a number of indicators through the exploratory factor analysis and identified 3 separate domains related to human and social assets, decision-making around income, mobility, family planning, purchasing, and then also a domain related to gendered violence and decision-making around when and when not to have sex. And those, the 3 domains that we found with the indicators, we developed a 12-item, 3-domain index that was invariant across the 5 countries, and we have just recently mapped that using a structural equation modeling approach to maternal nutrition indicators, and are in the process of doing it for child nutrition. And so what we have found using a structural equation modeling approach, which is based in mediation analysis, is that largely we have the assets that we see, and the ones that came out in the factor analysis is largely the age at which women are first married, at which they cohabitate and have their first child. The impacts of that on maternal BMI and on anemia are quite significant. But the relationship is mediated by women's attitudes towards domestic violence, and it's also mediated through women's decision-making. And so we're able to look at this for maternal nutrition and see really interesting effects with respect to maternal BMI and maternal anemia. What's important in this is that we found that the issues around decision-making for mobility as well as domestic violence are quite important for maternal and child nutrition. And these currently are not included in the Women's Empowerment and Livestock Index that the International Livestock Research Institute has developed and that we are working with them to validate. And so what we are currently doing with data from the field from Tanzania is taking the Women's Empowerment and Livestock Index, which is about 80 indicators, I believe. It's a very long and time-intensive survey. We're applying the same exploratory factor and confirmatory factor approach to try to reduce that burden of that index down into something much more manageable, and then look at associations using a similar structural equation modeling approach to maternal and child nutrition. And then we will also be repeating that in Ethiopia, where they're using the WEA livestock tool And in northern Kenya, we're not going to be able to do the quantitative assessment because we're not doing survey data, but we will be able to then use the qualitative data to further validate psychometrically the domains that are important for livestock-focused livelihoods in the context of maternal and child nutrition.
So yeah, well, I'm not allowed to speak, I was told, so I'm going to move straight on to Nanna Roos from the University of Copenhagen to introduce her project.
We were granted this project also 6 months ago, so it's we are in the still in the planning and implementation phase. So we don't have results at this stage. We have partners here from Bangladesh. Mamun is here, and from different other partners. So what is the project about? Well, we know fish are really the most nutritious fish food we can think of almost. What is special about the project is about developing a metric for assessing the impact of a very special aquatic food system in Bangladesh on nutrition and health. It's a very rich aquatic environment, and aquaculture have developed very quickly over the recent years, decades. And then we work in this coastal zone of Bangladesh, which is a very, very dynamic ecosystem where you have a salinity gradient coming from the coast up to an inland freshwater environment. So basically you have that this salinity is, stressful for the agriculture, but it's good for the high-value aquaculture production. So this coastal zone where you have intrusion of marine water, salt water into fresh water coming downstream, maybe up to 30, 50 kilometers inland, is also very vulnerable to climate change. Then there is a concern about that commercial export-oriented aquaculture has developed intensively in this region. And there has been a concern that this is on the expense of the food for local consumption. But in reality, when we really look into this system, they're very, very complex. And you don't just see the commercial prawn shrimps. You also see local fish, which goes directly for consumption. You have a value chain creating jobs and also some byproducts. So what is the aim of what we want to do? Well, we want to develop a metric for assessing the impact of this complex system on nutrition and health. So we use this high complexity of this aquatic system with this salinity gradient, to create a data set where we have this transition, in terms of fish species, production system, value chains, but actually also on the nutritional value of the fish in these systems. Different fish species has different micronutrient contents. It builds on some of Mamun's PhD work. But we also know that higher salinity leads to different impacts on the fatty acids composition of the fish. So the more saline, the higher contents of the long chain fatty acids. So we will have a data collection starting this year. It's fully in preparation, where we will do 2 repeated in 2 seasons cross-sectional survey, and we have decided to do it on adolescent girls as a highly nutritional vulnerable group. And we will do it across this salinity gradient. So we will see how the food system that impacts on the food production, the fish production system. You have the commercial system mixing in with capture fisheries, with local pond production. You have occupation in the fish value chain. You have a fish consumption pattern. And then we will have nutritional status indicators for anthropometric, micronutrient status, where we have selected on, and we will also have the fatty acid status of these adolescent girls, which will both be a nutritional indicator, but it will also be like a dietary biochemical indicator for fish consumption, which we have already seen in some of the pilot study that this is actually reflected. So the model will be developed with a health economist partner at Glasgow University and will be, well, an exploration of statistical relationships, basically on regression analysis and some PCA, and between the exposures from this complex aquatic system and the nutritional outcome parameters. So we hope to have a good description of this, and out of this, that we can develop an applicable metric that can be used to assess, well, how does these aquatic systems with these very nutritious foods impact on food and nutrition, and we have a chance to validate our outcomes on a data set we have access to in Cambodia.
I'm just curious what your mechanism through which fish production affects vitamin D status, and also could you talk a little bit about what well-being score is?
Well, yes, I expected this question. We had a discussion. Well, basically, the starting point was to assess for vitamin A and iron and zinc as the standards. But actually, the situation is that that vitamin A status actually is improving very much in Bangladesh. So we don't really expect to see so much on the, so much new on vitamin A status. So we actually decided to move into vitamin D, which has there was a micronutrient survey in 2012, which gave a clear indication that vitamin D deficiency might be a problem. And then we have the B12 because we have the focus on the animal source foods.
Okay. So let's finish our round of presentations first. There's only one to go, so Sukhwinder Singh is not allowed to talk anymore. And since all our speakers so far have been so efficient, I even have time to read the full name of our next speaker, which is Abu Hayat Mohammed Saiful Islam, is now going to tell us a bit about his research.
Now I would like to give some reflection on what I am doing in the Imana Fellowship. My background is kind of development economist, focusing on especially on the agriculture sector, including fisheries. And my PhD dissertation was also on fisheries, actually. In Imana, broadly, I'm working on kind of nexus between agriculture and nutrition with a special focus on fish in Bangladesh. And for Imana Fellowship, I'm using two sets of data set. One is the IFRI 2-round, this is called Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey. This is the first time in Bangladesh that is nationally representative, and panel for 2 rounds. I'm using that one, and the finding of that survey I will present on this symposium day after tomorrow. And another survey database I'm also using from the Pushan, it's from Nepal actually, because as you already heard that for Imana Fellowship we need 2 mentors. One is home mentor, another is host mentor. My home mentor is my PhD supervisor, maybe some of you know, Professor Joachim von Braun, the former Director General of IFRI. He's based in University of Bonn in Germany, where I did my PhD. And another home mentor is from Johns Hopkins. He's working on the Nutrition Innovation Lab in Bangladesh as well as in Nepal. So on that respect, I'm using the Nepal Pushan data for another objective. Kindly 2 kind of paper, one from Bangladesh and one from Nepal. And in the, other than this, I'm also working on other project actually with WorldFish. Initially, we had idea to work with WorldFish, but my host mentor was basically from WorldFish Center. Just he moved from WorldFish to Johns Hopkins. But still we have that project, I am running that one. But due to the last occurrence in Bangladesh, the project got delayed implementation, so we could not, survey the database. That's why I'm shifting to the secondary database. In the IFRI survey, as I said, this is panel, is 6,500 households for 2 rounds all over the Bangladesh nationally representative. Here I'm looking at particularly the links between farm diversification and food and nutrition security at the household level, as well as the individual, like in the woman, as well as the child level, using this 2-round data set, panel data set, as well as panel econometrics to see the causal link between production or farm diversification and nutrition in the household and inter-household level. And in the Nepal data set, the objective more or less the same, but little bit kind of disaggregating. The production diversity, just here I'm looking at only the who have the livestock ownership, and its links to the child stunting, mainly the child level nutrition indicators to see, and by using the panel econometrics, mainly, as you know that maybe some of the economists you know, that in cross-sectional setting is very difficult to control a lot of confounding factors, as we have seen also in the presentation, because we always need to control all the confoundings, but it's always difficult. But if you have the panel data, then your life is a bit easier than the cross-section. So in that respect, I'm thinking, I believe that my findings would be kind of causal relation between the two links. And I'm using as the dependent variable kind of things is kind of count variable. I will be using the Poisson regression, actually, Poisson fixed effect, as well as the random effect and pooled regression as well to check the robustness of the findings.
Okay, thank you, Saiful, and thanks to everyone. So now I would like to invite questions from the audience. We've already had one, but it seems like there's more interest.
That you said there is a problem with confounding in cross-sectional surveys, it's less in cohort. I would say that is not the case. Like, confounding is also in cohorts, but the problem you get rid of is reverse causality. You don't know which is chicken and which is egg, because in cross-section it's at the same time, whereas in cohorts you know which one was first. Just to clarify that, I think that was not correct.
Well, yes, I will try to answer. This is in the hand of the health economist, and it's still under development, and maybe Mammon can give more questions. It's basically built on an scoring system that they have used in health assessment, and it's based on to the mental stage, and if you feel anxious and can't sleep at night and so it's a series of questions about the general well-being of these adolescent girls.
I was telling that in cross-section, in the difference between panel and cross-section, in the cross-section you cannot, it's difficult to, control this kind of unobserved heterogeneity problem, particularly the time variant and time. But if you have panel, at least you can control sort of the unobserved heterogeneity problems.
My question is for the post-harvest losses for nutrients. I'm just curious to see, in terms of the maize, what nutrients are you going to be looking at? That's beyond, with the exception of the quality protein maize. And then the other question that I have to ask is, are you going to take into account different varieties of maize? And given the countries that you are working in, how are you going to deal with hybrid varieties versus the traditional varieties that people are growing? So where will your focus be?
Looking at 3 different crops, maize, cowpea, and sweet potato. So in the case of maize, we will be working with maize from Zimbabwe. So we have also 2 countries. So we have in Zimbabwe we have maize and cowpea, and in Uganda we have maize and sweet potato. So for the maize, it will be maize from Zimbabwe. So we have the white maize and also the high quality protein maize. And for all the crops, we look at the same nutrients. So we have macronutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrate, and we have also some micro, so I don't know if you can hear micronutrients, so that are very important for deficiencies, so vitamin A, iron and zinc.
I said yes and no. I think but you have raised more curiosity. Maybe I'll follow you up later on. The issue for me is, if you're going to be doing maize in Zimbabwe, the white maize that you are talking about is not homogeneous. It's not one variety that everybody is planting. And so are you going to look at that source of variability? Because maybe there are certain hybrid varieties that might actually preserve nutrients better than others. And so are you just going to mix up different varieties in your sample? Are you going to look at them separately? Those are the issues. And then in addition to that, then there is the traditional varieties that are not hybrid maize, and the structure is a little bit different. The rate at which losses of nutrients, some nutrients might take place, might be different because of that. It's that complexity that I was wondering whether that is a factor that you will also look into. But I can follow up with you later on.
Thank you for raising this very good point. We are aware of the complexity, and it's also kind of, we have to make choices in this project on the things we select, but we are aware that there is much more. And I have to say, this is a 2-year project, so it's kind of a proof of concept. So we are hoping as that this same concept will grow in the future. So nutrition post-harvest losses, we hope that this is something that it's at the beginning, and then there will be other projects, or we hope that there will be room for further development. But in this small project, we have to make choices. So we will go for the most pragmatic, practical solutions. So I think in Zimbabwe we are selecting the most common variety of maize, but we are relying on our local partners there to tell us what are the best varieties, what are the most common that we could work on.
More specific question on structural equation modeling. How did you determine the pathways? Or did you first, develop the pathways in one data set and test it on another?
So the way we've started with it was with using existing theoretical frameworks. So with Kabir's framework is the one that we started with for women's empowerment, and using mediation analysis to assess the sort of direct and indirect, and then putting them in together to identify the various coefficients. But yes, we had looked at a couple of different modeling approaches, and tested several different variations of the causal pathway in various path models, and then have been looking at the model fit statistics to help us identify the one that is the best fit for the data. We don't test it on another data set. That's what we do for the exploratory confirmatory factor analysis. So we do, when we're trying to develop the actual index and the factors that are there and the indicators that go into the various factors, there we'll typically do a random split sample. And so if we have a large enough data set, which we do with DHS data, so we can do a random pool of the data and develop the factors and identify the factors from the factor loadings and the domains using the exploratory factor analysis approach. And then we look at that, we apply that factor approach to the second half and for a confirmatory factor analysis and look at the factor loadings and cross loadings there. And then what we do is we take those factors that we have identified and confirmed, and then we put those into the structural equation modeling approach and see how those different domains interrelate and then contribute direct and indirectly to the outcomes. And then for the child nutrition, for maternal nutrition, it's a very simplified path model, looking specifically at assets through decision-making and gender, which is how that worked out, into BMI and anemia. Because in the DHS, there aren't data for dietary intake for women. For children, we're going to actually be able to add in a bit more complexity and look at how it works through infant and young child feeding practices and even potentially health seeking for child nutritional status. The other interesting thing that we've been able to do is look at invariance across socioeconomic tertiles. And so what we're seeing actually is that there's almost a threshold effect for women's empowerment, where as you increase in socioeconomic status tertiles, you see that women's empowerment can play a larger role because it's as if they need more of those enabling assets, and there is somewhat of a threshold effect, a necessary socioeconomic base that's needed for empowerment to really impact some of these nutritional indicators.
Thanks. Just going back, follow up with that question. Do you see that effect with the different levels of education also?
It's really interesting because when we were developing and working through the exploratory factor analysis in the DHS data, education actually fell out. It didn't load. And that's not often the case when you're looking at education and empowerment. It usually is quite an enabling asset. And what we think is that it didn't load. It did in, I think, 2 countries. I don't remember which 2. I think it loaded in Rwanda and Uganda, but it did not load in Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And it may be because education just measures years of education, and it may not know, and we know that education, there are quality components that come into that. And so if you've got a variable that maybe doesn't have good sensitivity for your domain that you're interested in, it may not work as well. So it may just be that in this particular context. What we're hoping to do is take this type of analysis and begin to explore the exploratory factor analysis approach and confirmatory factor analysis approach in other regions to see if we see similar types of an invariant structure coming up, and if similar things fall out, or if they stay in. So yeah, the education one was quite interesting in that it fell out.
To me, like one of the main functions, one of the main reasons why we model is that we of course need to learn lessons from particular places and somehow extrapolate them to the wider world. Like in the CGIAR, we're always forced now to think about our impact pathway and our theory of change. And in the end, the targets that are out there are kind of these millions and millions of farmers that we ultimately want to reach. So I'm wondering, with the modeling approaches we've heard about, are we going in that direction? Will we be able to learn lessons that we can then use to kind of generalize and apply elsewhere, or will we always rely on collecting massive data sets everywhere we work? Is there our kind of general conclusions on the horizon in any of our work? I mean, Amy, you just said things are always site specific. Is there what's the scope for big truth that will help us elsewhere?
I don't deal with the complexity data that you do, so I don't know if I can answer the kind of question you're asking. But I know at least for us, when we deal with something like empowerment, people have looked at it in so many different ways, and the current tools that are out there take over an hour to administer. Just the empowerment modules take over an hour, and that's way too time burdensome. And so I think if we can do some of this preliminary data and really hone in on what are the most important properties that are important for maternal and child nutrition, if we're looking at it from a nutrition standpoint or in the context of these different agricultural domains, I think that's really important and could be a huge contribution so that we don't need to do surveys that take an hour and a half to measure just one aspect of our impact pathway. You know, we've used structural equation modeling and path analysis to do just what you've mentioned, examine an entire program impact pathway for HKI projects in Nepal. And that paper is in progress. And I think it's really helpful because you can then tease out which pathways are important. But again, you really run into issues when you're doing that with the quality of the data. And if you're actually capturing some of these more complex domains correctly, like knowledge or like empowerment, or even when we move into things like income and expenditures, those are very important pathways, but capturing that data is very time consuming if you do it correctly. And so I think that's some of the problems we're going to face. It's not just the vast amounts of data, but it's identifying how to collect it with high quality so that we can reduce the error and get more precise modeling.
So in our case, we are developing a metric, so nutrition post-harvest loss estimate that is new. And so what we are doing is we are developing it on a few crops and in a few countries. But then at the end of the project, we will propose a dissemination model so for other countries and other crops. So it's true that you still have to collect the data, but hopefully with the knowledge that we've gathered and the lessons that we've gathered from this project, it will be easier and easier to collect the data for people who will actually follow up with other crops and other countries. And we will also have the development of the platform that will be ready, so it will be easier to then just feed the data into this model in the future.
I normally use the econometrics for causal analysis. But one of the major criticism of the modeling is like, the complex problem. You are modeling the complex problem, so but to show all these complexities in the model, and you need the data. But sometimes it's difficult to get the data for a lot of variables. So how do you do? You try to simplify the complexities. You have to do that, because if you don't have data, then for simplifying, you always have to have a lot of assumption. But sometimes those assumptions are not close to the reality. That's why, one of the criticism even in publication, in modeling, things is publication is very difficult. Initially in my PhD, I started to do, kind of CZE modeling. But Von Braun was telling, no, it would be very difficult to publish. Even nowadays, it's difficult to find a reviewer for CZE because not so many publications, not so many experts or something.
Well, the modeling that we will do in this new project is really explorative as a starting point to look into this quite special system with this complex aquatic food production, with combining capture wild fish with the aquaculture. So why is it interesting to look at this special system? It's because we do see around the world where we have these floodplain ecosystems with a very rich aquatic high biodiversity, but it goes hand in hand with the high nutritional poor nutrition. And the special about the system is that it provides this very, very nutritious food, that the fish is so special. So you actually say, well, how can you have with all this malnutrition at the same time you have? If you look at much of the data coming from Bangladesh, it's highlighted, well, see how important the fish is. It's eaten in a very high frequency. But when you look into the details, the portion sizes are very small. So what we hope to see is like to pinpoint what are the pathways that could lead from this very rich nutritional source, which is right out of your door, to improve nutrition. Does it go directly through consumption? Has it an impact if you are a producing household or you are somewhere in the value chain? So it is really explorative, and we have this chance then to try to validate or to apply it to a data set we have from Access to in Cambodia.
On the women's empowerment one, and it comes from you saying education for women was not loading, and I'm wondering if you are looking at subnational disparities and whether perhaps education might load in one cultural setting but not in another within the same country.
And we did not do it in to that degree of granularity. We looked at it at a national level. And then in the cross-country, it was looking at it across all the countries and controlling for the country cluster. And so it was not looking at it specifically isolated within sort of geographic region or ethnic group within the country itself. So no, we did not go down to that granularity, but that would be quite an interesting approach. I would also say that going back to one of your comments about all the data we have to collect along program impact pathways, I think, especially in regards to context, I know in y'all's approach, there's the participatory model for identifying some of the indicators, and I think it's important for us to remember the importance of qualitative participatory work as a way to not only gain greater nuance, but also to identify better, stronger indicators so that we maybe don't need to bombard people with a whole bunch of questions that might not be relevant. And I think that qualitative research, at least what we've found for the women's empowerment, has been very important in helping us understand the exploratory factor analysis for our WELI, because they developed the WELI using face validity and content validity with experts to design all the questions. without the qualitative first. We've gone back into the qualitative, and we're looking at all these things that really are actually not relevant, and we can likely reduce it almost in half if we think about what's relevant in the communities themselves with the qualitative.
We've had a pretty rich set of case studies here, I mean, including Sukhwinder's work and what I introduced earlier and the different approaches here. And I think what comes out as a conclusion to me is that there is a lot of attempts to now understand the way systems work. I mean, there is a way there's a kind of the traditional way of just looking at data and seeing what relationships are there, but we're now moving into a phase where we're exploring the relationships and the processes that are behind it. There are ways to identify critical variables that are important and actually carry a lot of information, so we can reduce the burden on people answering our questionnaires. I think there's probably more scope for doing more of this. There's probably also scope for learning to work without massive data collection efforts. I think that is in some way a frontier, and there's a bit of a conflict to what journal reviewers might request us to do, which is always the high quality, perfect data sets that are simply not available at the scale that we in international development need to work on. Again, there are millions of people who kind of need our help, thousands of decisions we're supposed to support. Yeah, I think there is scope for learning to work with what experts know, kind of reasonable ranges for things, move more into probabilistic approaches where in the end we may have not have precise knowledge on something, but we have sufficient knowledge for supporting decisions. To me, that's a bit of a frontier that we as modelers probably are the ones to help bridge in the end. But I think we're well on track to achieving this, and there's the future for modeling obviously is bright, especially with the help of Imana and similar programs. And well, I hope you share my view, and I want to thank you all for your attention. And yeah, let's move on.